Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of the semester. What I like doing for this first lecture is supplementing what we've gone over in the Dennings book um, and going over some of the basics, or basically what I call the foundations of human communication and nonverbal communication. Because I think while this book is fantastic about talking about different strategies and how to communicate with your team, it mostly focuses on telling stories, but I'd like supplementing that with some of my own background in communication. So that's going to be the focus for today. Let's go ahead and get started. So first we want to talk about human communication, and depending on what kind of textbook or which textbook you pick up, there are a number of different definitions that you'll find. So this is the one that we're going to use. So communication is a transactional process in which people generate meaning through the exchange of verbal and nonverbal messages in specific contexts, influenced by individual and societal forces and embedded in culture. So we're going to break that down over these next few slides, and I'm going to use a couple models as well. So first we have message creation, right? And that basically involves encoding and decoding it. And that's just a fancy way of saying when you encode your message, you're trying to figure out what is the best possible way I can package up this message so the person who I'm talking to can unwrap it and understand it, right? And that's basically what they're doing with the decoding process. They talk about how human communication is symbolic, right? So we are creating meaning using the symbols that we use when we communicate. And the metaphor, not necessarily the metaphor, but the example I like using when I'm teaching this class in person is I'll go up to the board and I'll draw what looks like a cat, right? And it'll be really simple. It'll just be a circle, a couple triangles on the top, and I'll draw eyes, nose, and some whiskers, and people right away tell me it's a cat. And then I'll say, like, well, what is it really? And they'll let me know, well, it's a drawing of a cat. But we've come to understand that using that type of symbol symbolizes and stands for a cat. But that goes for a number of the ways that we communicate with one another, right? We've all, particularly in the United States, but in any given speech community, we have created the language and what it means to us. If you were to go back 10 years ago and someone were to tell you that party was really lit, people would be like, well, was there a fire involved? What happened at this party? But we've all understood now when someone says a party was lit, it means something radically different than it did 10 years ago. And that's a really weird example to use, but that gives you a really great idea of what we mean when we say that communication is symbolic, right? We have created the meaning, and that helps us when it comes to the understanding portion of that communication. The content, of course, is going to be important, but the relationship is important, right? The way that you talk to your coworkers or your employees is radically different than the way you're going to speak to your wife or your husband or your children even, right? So the relationship is going to affect your communication as well. The setting is going to be will affect it depending on where you're talking, what the group setting is. You know, if I'm speaking to a graduate level course and we're all sitting in a circle, it changes the dynamic versus me standing in front of undergraduates in a classroom and they're all just in front of me. Even something small like that can change. Participants are obviously going to be important. And then the channels we use, right? Whether you're talking face-to-face, if you're using FaceTime, if you're doing it via text message, all of those are the different channels we use to communicate. And then there's noise, right? And there's different kinds of noise. Mostly when people think about it, they're thinking about the physical noise. So if you're sitting in a classroom and the air conditioner is loud or someone's tapping a pen, there's that type of noise. But there's other types of noise as well too, right? Like if you have a really bad headache, you're less likely to be paying attention and really process as much as if you didn't have a headache, right? And then we get outside of like physical pain and we think about depression or anxiety or even just emotions, right? I'm sure we've all had that moment where we just left a heated argument and then we jump into a different scenario when we're having to talk to other people and we're not really processing the full conversation that's going on because we're still kind of like festering on that last incident. All of that stuff is considered noise. And then lastly, we have feedback. And that's really important in terms of being able to have a really good dialogue or communication with another individual or with a group of people is being able to understand and respond to that feedback. So let's go over some of these models here. So this is a real basic model, linear model. You can take a look at that. And the best example of this type of model would be like the radio, television, even if you've ever been shopping somewhere and someone speaks over the intercom, or if you're at the airport and you hear that, that's basically one person sending a message, someone receiving it, and there's not much feedback, if at all, right? There's going to be noise, so they're using a channel, there's a message, but it's just one-way direction. But then we expand on that when we start thinking about communication, right? So we have the big change here is we have the message going back and forth between the two. And then what got added in this interactive model is the field of experience around each of the participants. They use field of experience, and I usually like calling it your frame of reference. And everybody has a different frame of reference. It basically is comprised of everything you've experienced up until that very moment of that conversation. So it involves the friends you had during your childhood. It involves the family members that surrounded you, the movies you watched, the TV shows you watched, the music that you listened to, the church that you went to. All of those things shape your frame of reference. So when someone were to bring up a sensitive issue like the death penalty, you immediately know how you feel about that particular issue because of your frame of reference or your field of experience, right? All of those different things have shaped the way that you talk about that particular issue. Similarly, that frame of reference is going to affect everything that you talk about, right? If someone were to talk about your feeling, like if you're in a romantic relationship and you're having a conversation and the subject of marriage were to come up, or the subject of divorce were to come up, your entire field of reference is going to affect how you believe and how you discuss that particular issue. So that's really important when you're thinking about communication and how you talk to other people. Lastly, we have the synergetic model, right? A lot of the same things that are going on in the previous one, but there are some changes and some adaptations, right? So we have the relationships involved, right? How are they related to one another? We have the context of the conversation. And we have the individual and societal forces, and there are a number of different individual and societal forces to think about. On an individual level, it might be the way that you were raised. It might be your own personal culture and the way that you've been brought up to talk to other people. We have societal forces, right? So some people talk about, political correctness, but more in general, I like talking about making sure that you're respecting the people around you. And so those things are going to affect the way you talk to other people. And then the big circle we have here is culture, and that's mostly talking about the culture of where you're at. So particularly for this course, we're talking about leadership communication. So whatever culture you're in or organization you're in, that really is going to affect the culture of that organization, is going to affect the way you speak to one another, especially if you're in a large corporation where you think about HR and what's allowed and not allowed and what's discouraged. Like all of those things are going to affect the way you communicate with one another. So that clearly has an effect on the ongoing conversations that are happening between you as a leader and your team members. So we've talked about all these different things and all the ways that they can influence your communication and things that you have to be aware of, right? When you're talking to different people in your team, you have to consider all these different forces and all these different items that are part of communication. Now, when we're talking about communication, more often than not, people think about verbal communication, right? The actual words that we're saying. But nonverbal communication is just as, if not more important than verbal communication. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So nonverbal communication is defined as the intentional or unintentional transmission of meaning through an individual's non-spoken physical and behavioral cues. And that last part's really important because most people think it's just like the tone of your voice or the inflection or how loud you're speaking, but all the different ways that you move, the things that you're wearing, and we're going to go over all of that, but all of those things communicate to the people around you. So what are some of the principles of nonverbal communication? First of all, it uses multiple channels, including auditory, visual, and tactile, so being able to touch things, right? It's more ambiguous than verbal communication, and it has fewer rules. So we're going to get into how all of those things kind of manifest within nonverbal communication, but it also helps to be aware of these things when we're talking to other people. So it has more meaning. Depending on what study you're looking at or who you're talking to, some people argue that it conveys 60 to 90% of the meaning we get out of our interactions, right? So, for example, let's say you're fighting with your significant other, and in the middle of that conversation, you say, you know what, I am tired of this argument, and I'm going to go with my friends, okay? And if they were to say, yeah, that's fine. That might be the words that they're saying, but clearly through nonverbal communication, we understand that's not the message that they're sending to us, right? So that often leads to mixed messages, right? This idea when verbal and nonverbal messages contradict one another. And lastly, nonverbal communication is absolutely influenced by culture. So, for example, I got my PhD in at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and during my training as a teaching assistant, I was told that one thing we have to be aware of is that there's a large Native American population in New Mexico. And for many instructors, we've been taught that when someone is talking to you as a sign of respect, they should be looking right at you. So if a student isn't looking at you, that means they're not paying attention and they don't care what you're talking about. But we were informed that for some Native American tribes or people, that looking at someone directly in the eyes while they're speaking to you is a sign of disrespect. So oftentimes those students won't be looking at you directly in the eye for that reason. That's something you need to be aware of, right? It could easily cause one of these mixed messages. It's influenced by gender, and this book was written a few years ago, so some of these things have changed. But generally, these are some of the things that were brought up through some of the studies on nonverbal communication. So women are better at sending and receiving nonverbal messages. Men are more territorial, and men prefer greater conversational distance and frequent eye contact. One of the benefits of technology is that it's helped and improved nonverbal communication, right? There's different media that you can choose from, whether it's Skype or Hangouts, even emojis, right? That those help in terms of the communication that you're having. It makes better for long distance relationships, and in the workplace, it helps bring together different departments or different branches of an organization that are far away from one another. And lastly, nonverbal and verbal communication combine to create what we know generally as communication. So when we talk about nonverbal communications, the last thing we're going to do for this lecture is go over the 8 different means that we use to transmit information nonverbally. Okay. So first we have kinesics, right? This is most of the behaviors we associate with nonverbal communication. Some of those are listed there. But it's some of the basic things that we think about, right? So facial expressions, and this includes those emoticons, emojis, and I would argue they somewhat even include the GIFs that some people use when they're text messaging or sending DMs via Instagram. But all of those things bring up facial expressions. We have eye contact, right? Eye contact is really crucial when it comes to nonverbal communication. And for the purposes of this lecture, we're focusing on U.S. culture, right? Or U.S. kind of typical U.S. culture. And we'll kind of use that kind of vaguely, but it helps in expressing emotions. It regulates turn taking. So if you think about, like, if you're in let's just say a regular interpersonal setting when you're talking to friends, especially like you're in a bar, it's a loud bar, a lot of things going on. If you're all talking to one another, if you're specifically trying to direct a question to one individual, you can look them dead in the eye and without having to point to them, ask a question, and they know that you're talking to them, right? It helps regulate that turn taking when you're having a conversation. Like I just said, it indicates attentiveness when you're listening, but it can absolutely convey hostility, right? A lot of the emotions that we're talking about are expressed through eye contact. There's also gestures, right? There's 4 different types of gestures that this particular author talked about. So we have emblems, illustrators, regulators, and adapters. So if you think of emblems, you think about maybe someone giving the thumbs up, the peace sign, the middle finger. All of those things are different emblems that stand for something else. And of course, culture is going to affect what emblems mean what in different countries and whatnot. But that's an example of emblems. We have illustrators. So if someone were to ask you, well, how tall is that chair that you're thinking about buying, you can kind of use with your hand how tall that is. Or how big was that fish that you caught? And you kind of like show with your hands how big that fish was. We have regulators, right? So if you think about when, let's say, so you're driving down the street and someone is in the middle of the road with their hand straight up, with their palm facing you, that's someone clearly telling you to stop. But someone who also might be telling you to stop is if you're driving down the road and someone's jumping up and down and kind of crossing their arms back and forth, kind of trying to get your attention because there's an emergency. They're both trying to get you to stop, but they're kind of using 2 different things or 2 different regulators to get you to stop. And lastly, we have adapters. And kind of the best example I can give of that is for folks who go to a different, let's say you're just traveling to a different country and you're trying to get your point across, but you're talking with someone who may not know your language very well. Oftentimes we'll use adapters to kind of add on to what we're saying. So if you're trying to ask someone where is the bathroom or where is the library, you might use, like, say you're trying to get someone to tell you where the library is, you might, kind of put your palms together and open them up like you're talking about a book and where could I go get this, or if you're trying to ask where could I go get eat, where could I get something to eat, you might kind of point to your mouth like you want to eat. Those are adapters. And lastly, we're going to talk about posture, right? Oftentimes it'll convey immediacy and power. Some folks like to take up, a lot of space by kind of making themselves bigger, making themselves taller. You can convey hostility or power if you are walking towards somebody as you're talking to them. You might not change your voice, but you are kind of displaying your power by moving forward and kind of pushing someone away from you just by how much, just by the way you're posturing yourself to somebody else. Next, we'll talk about communicating through your voice, right? These are all the different characteristics we use when we're talking, right? Loudness, pitch, speech rate, and tone. And sarcasm really is the best example of how we can change the message without changing the words, right? A lot of the ways that we communicate through sarcasm is the same message, but you're using a different pitch, you're using a different speech rate or your tone. Oftentimes that phrase, right? It's not about what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. That's all vocalics. The next thing we'll talk about is communicating through touch, otherwise known as haptics, right? And there's different kinds of touch, right? There's functional and professional touches, which you're mostly going to see in the workplace. Social, polite touch, that's usually, okay, you have some people in your place of work where, you're just cordial, and then you have the folks at work that you're a little bit more polite with or more friendly with. Then you have your friendship warmth touch. That could be some of the coworkers that you're really friends with, as well as your friends outside of work. We have love intimacy touch. That can also be for some of your very close friends, usually reserved for your family. Of course, we have sexual arousal touch, and then we have aggressive hostile touch. All of these things affect the way that we communicate to one another and communicate something differently, right? So if you were to, let's say you're talking to your child, right, and you say, can you go throw, the trash out, right? You don't touch them or anything, or let's say you just kind of pat them on the shoulder. Can you go take the trash out? Well, they know that that's something that you want them to do, and that conveys a certain message. If you were to grab your child by the back of the neck and squeeze and say, go take the trash out, that conveys a much different tone and message, right? They are most likely going to stop it, whatever it is that they're doing, and go take the trash out. You take that over into the workplace, and you can see how that can translate as well. Not translate, but how that could play out as well, right? If someone were to say, is there any way that you can stay after work and work on this project a little bit longer? It's different than if someone were to grab you very harshly on your shoulder or on the back of your neck and say, I'm going to need you to stay a few hours later and make sure this project gets done, right? You can see how quickly we can move from like social polite to aggressive hostile and change the whole dynamic of potentially not just that conversation, but of your entire relationship, and it's things that we should be aware of. Next, we have communicating through personal space, otherwise known as proxemics. And very simply put, we have these different space ranges that affect the way, how comfortable we might be with another person, right? We usually reserve like the intimate space for our friends, our really close friends, our family members, our significant others. We have our personal space, right? If you're in a social setting, with people that you're familiar with, that's kind of your personal space in 18 inches to 4 feet. We have our social space. Let's say you're showing up somewhere for a meet and greet of some kind. And you have your social space, right? 4 to 12 feet is where you're generally comfortable with. Think about the way you kind of interact with people at a party, especially if it's not too loud. Then we have our public space, which is 12 feet or more. And the last thing to think about is territoriality, right? How we claim physical spaces at our own. So we can go back to that same example of combining posture, right? If you're kind of making yourself look and feel bigger by standing up straight and kind of puffing out your chest. And then you combine that with territoriality of walking closer to someone and taking up more space in a room to, again, signify that power. But we do that all the time. If you think about, how we take up space to make it our own, even if it's a public space. If you've ever been to the movie theater and someone throws, purses and jackets across an entire row because they're trying to save it for a family, that's an example of like taking up a space and making it your own. Next, we're going to talk about communicating through time, which is also known as chronemics. And I'm going to use just these two examples here. We have monochromatic time and polychromatic time. And basically, when you think about M time, it's someone who has a particular schedule, right? They know exactly from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock during the workday, they know exactly what they're doing. It's in their schedule, whether it's on their phone or an actual physical book or schedule. From 8 to 9, I'm doing this. I leave that meeting. I'm going to be from 9:15 to 9:45. When that's done, like everything is on a particular schedule. When there's a time for something, they're probably going to show up 5 to 10 minutes earlier. That's what it's like to be on M time. P time's different. P time is, well, I have a meeting with Fred at 9, but traffic might be crazy. So, just let them know I'll be there anytime between like 8:50 and 9:15. And don't schedule anything for a while, because me and Fred, we just get to talking, and we might go from there and go to lunch. Like P time kind of just goes with the flow. And it's very easy to see how if you are someone who runs on one type of time and you enter into an organization that runs on a different kind of time, how that can cause some miscommunication or can communicate something differently, right? If you think about someone who continually shows up late, they may not be doing it on purpose, and they may just think, well, people know how I am, and they just get accustomed to it. But for some folks, it might signify something else, right? It might communicate that, hey, I think my time is more important than yours, right? So you really have to think about how we use time to communicate to other people. Next, we have communicating through physical appearance, right? So that includes our hair, our clothing, our body type. All of those things play a particular role and communicate a particular thing, right? And I think we're all aware of that. Like how someone dresses when in the workplace, depending on what they're wearing, communicates something about them, right? It's why some people take a lot of pride in the brands that they're wearing and the shoes that they're wearing. And even body types play a role, right? If you, I'm a larger individual, and I know for a fact that when it comes to my body type, there are some people who may look at me and think that this person might be lazy, they're unmotivated, they're undisciplined. And there's a lot of judgments being made about someone who is overweight versus someone who is underweight, right? There are a lot of things, and people use excuses like, well, I'm just concerned about their health. But there's not necessarily there's not always necessarily a link between being overweight and being unhealthy. But for some folks, being a particular body size communicates something. The similar thing could be said for someone who is like incredibly muscular. Some people think that they're disciplined. Some people might be thinking that they are vain, right? Because all they're concerned about is being at the gym and how much protein they're getting. But body types can also play a particular role in communicating something to the people around you. The book also talks about facial symmetry, and the only thing that I remember from giving this lecture is that the book talked about how people who have a symmetrical face, where basically the one side of the face almost mirrors the other side, they appear to be more attractive to the people around them. So people are attracted to people who have a symmetrical face. And for whatever reason, this stuck with me that Denzel Washington has one of the most symmetrical faces in terms of celebrities. And we just talked about clothing, right? So depending on what you're wearing and particularly even how you wear it communicates something to the people around you. And lastly, we're going to be talking about objects in the environment. So we have artifacts that people have to signify power and status. So if you think about cars, right, the way that some people like driving really expensive cars, because it conveys a sense of power or status for people. There's a lot of different things. So even though we were talking about clothing, I would say like jewelry or even watches often can signify something as an artifact that people use and wear. And then we have the environment, and we have fixed features. So if you think about like if someone were to build, let's say an office, right? But for whatever reason, they have a large office and they decided they wanted to have pillars in their office. That signifies something, right? They are trying to still convey that sense of status. And then we have semi-fixed features. So the way someone may use a desk, this idea of feng shui and the type of space that you're creating, the kind of environment that you're creating. And it's not just in the office, right? I think for a lot of folks, it's why HGTV is so popular as a channel. Like people are looking at how they can create a certain type of space and communicate something about themselves by the way that they've created and decorated their house. So in terms of the functions of nonverbal communication, it serves 5 particular functions, right? It conveys meaning, expresses emotions, presents ourselves to other people, it helps manage our interactions, and it defines our relationships. I thought it was really important to go over not just communication, but nonverbal communication again, because Denning does a great job discussing some of these things. And in fact, he goes so far as to talk about the way that a leader should carry themselves. But he didn't go further than what you might get in like a public speaking class. And I think it's really important to go over how much is involved with nonverbal communication, because it's something that I think you should think about as a leader and as you're leading your team, that it's not necessarily just the words that you're saying, but it's all those other little behaviors that come together to form nonverbal communication and work together with what you're actually saying.